So you have Brian still making it clear, Your Honor, I did not want to do this. But it's not about me. It's about my client. And as defense lawyers, we got to deal with this all the time. Brian still said, listen, I told my client, I think we could win this. But it was Mr. Williams who said, I'm the one that got to sit here for possibly 3 more months or longer. I'm the one away from my family. I'm the one that's eating out of a Dorito bag. I'm the one that's sleeping on this hard pavement.
Call your first witness. I got Kenneth Willis. He bought his business, he gon' take it the distance. Listen, he giving gaming, believing high level represent. Call your first witness. Yeah, call your first witness.
Griff has been paid for this endorsement.
What's good, what's good, what's good, beautiful people? How you doing? How you living? How life treating you? Welcome to another episode of Call Your First Witness. It's your boy, K. Will, checking in. And look, my apologies. Let me just go ahead and say it out the gate. I know your boy been AWOL for a minute, and I didn't get a chance to even tell y'all, listen, man, I'm going to be sitting out for a while. It's been a minute. You know, my last episode was late August. I hate that it took me this long to get back in the studio. And I don't take your time lightly. I don't assume that I could just be MIA for a minute and we're going to all pick back up right where we left off at. I don't. So I want to apologize for, you know, the extended amount of time where I'm just out for the count, the hiatus, without even putting y'all on notice. You know, a lot of stuff didn't happen since my last episode. You know, stuff with the Young Thug trial, of course, P. Diddy, and where K. Will at, right? Where I'm at. I'm sure that was some of y'all questions. That was some of y'all thoughts, right? Of course, I done ran into people I know really well, and they'll check me. They you know, they hold me accountable. They say, K. Will, it's been a minute, you know. What's good with you? You know, I haven't heard of you. You know, shout out to Howard, man, the leader of Black Men Run. You know, I spoke to him not too long ago. He was like, listen, bro, it's been a minute since you posted. What's good? I was almost about to check on you and see if everything was cool. You know, my wife got on me really bad, y'all. She was like, man, this is unacceptable. What you doing, bro? You know, it's been a minute. I don't have a whole lot of excuses for you other than, you know, and I'm not going to oversimplify it by just giving you one of those general life, be life, and all that kind of stuff. It's been very challenging in my profession, and not even in a bad sense. I'm not even going to lie to you, man. I've been through transition with new opportunities, all for the good. But, you know, in that process, it takes time to really get back in the groove of things, you know. And unfortunately, the things you really, really love, like me podcasting, had to take a back seat. I'm not here to come up with excuses, and I'm sharing this with you because I know it wasn't cool for me just dipping like that. You understand? Because I value your time, like I said, and over the months I felt the growth in terms of the viewership, the listeners, right? And so again, it's not cool, but I'm back. Most importantly, because this is something I'm very serious about, and despite some of the challenges, I plan on taking this to another level with you all, right? And so here I am, y'all. It just so happened that when I've been telling myself I got to get back in the studio, of course, the news came out, Young Thug is free, right? And y'all think about that. On May 9th, 2022, Young Thug was arrested, right? And was incarcerated for the length of pretrial, jury selection, this long, tumultuous trial, as we all know. Y'all, that's 911 days. Right? Young Thug is now free. But it's not a storybook ending because Young Thug had to plead guilty to some of these charges. Now, you can say what you want and say, oh, you know what I mean? He didn't really say guilty on all the charges. Listen, for all practical purposes, a no contest is a guilty plea. Right? Now, it means that the defendant wishes not to contest the allegations, but for all practical purposes, I don't care in the criminal justice system and whether you're trying to go get jobs, other opportunities, it serves the same as any guilty plea. And so it's not a storybook ending, which we probably foresaw based on the crumbling effect of this particular trial, that Young Thug was going to be found not guilty on all the counts, right? We didn't have a crystal ball, right? We didn't know precisely how this was going to play out, but based on the course of the trial and what unfolded right before our eyes, and the DAs losing their momentum as the months, weeks, days went by, we had reason to believe that Young Thug was going to come out this thing unscathed. Let's keep it 100. And so now we have learned that Young Thug is free with a caveat to it. He had to plead guilty to some of these charges, guilty to some, no contest to others. But at the end of the day, they're guilty pleas, right? And if you heard when Young Thug pled a lot of charges as it related to the RICO charges, he pled no contest, but there was one gang-related charge he pled guilty to. And that was a charge in which the judge acknowledged, listen, because you have pled guilty to one gang-related charge, I'm acknowledging that, and this is also part of my leniency. So a lot of folks are happy for Young Thug, happy that he's with his family, but the way this case was going, we wanted to see it end in a different way. Yo, Judge Whitaker fell out the sky, right? Came in on this case, looked at it with a fresh set of eyes, fresh ears, very fair, very objective, very stern, and out the gate, she began to notice what we were seeing. The state all over the place. The state is having difficulty connecting the dots. Do they really have a grasp on the evidence of the case? And as time passed, Judge Whitaker became clear that Adrian Love didn't know what the heck she was doing. And I hate to say that about an attorney. If you look at episode 1, man, I came out the gate giving Adrian Love all her respect, all the years she put in. I said she was experienced, she was equipped for the task, all that. I looked at her in an opening statement. I saw someone that was poised. I saw somebody that was locked into her case. And as time progressed, it became apparent to me, it became apparent to you, and most importantly, it became apparent to Judge Whitaker that Adrian Love was in over our head. Now, I really don't think this was a situation where Adrian Love just didn't know what she was doing. I still don't believe that, y'all. I don't know. I can't tell you she was inept, but what I realized, and I covered this on my last episode, the case was too big. It was too massive. It had too many moving parts, such that she could not get a grasp on all the things that she was trying to accomplish, right? It was the fire festival of trials. And that's why an opportunity presented itself. Y'all, when Judge Whitaker came on this case, she already came in realizing this trial is taking too long. You could have been from Mars and just turned on the trial, and you could have been like, why all these creatures keep coming back to the same place and not getting anywhere? Right? Like, it didn't take long for her to realize, hold up, what are we doing? And so Judge Whitaker, although she had the black robe, you have to understand, judges are also mediators. Most cases, No matter what courtroom you're in, most cases settle. They resolve. They don't end up in trial. I remember talking to a judge not too long ago, a criminal judge. And he said, Willis, look, man, cases need to be resolved. And I've heard other judges say that all cases should get resolved. Now, as a criminal defense attorney, I may not agree with that because I say, well, listen, the only way some of these cases need to be resolved is if they get dismissed. Because based on the evidence or the lack thereof, I'm not getting my client to plead to these charges if we're talking about that's what a resolution is. And so that's what you saw over the course of this particular trial. No question, I'm sure the previous judge wanted all parties to resolve this matter. I'm sure they had those conversations, but yet and still, they were at a stalemate. We know what Adrian Love's position was on behalf of the state of Georgia, and we know what the defense attorney's positions were, right? And so in terms of working that out, they already had the individuals who pled. This wasn't just a 6-defendant indictment. This had a whole bunch of defendants on, and some pled, moved on. Remember Sergio Kitchens, Gunner? He got up out of there, y'all. I ain't playing with these people. I got a career. I don't got time to be dealing with all this. Him and his lawyer probably had the foresight to say, look, we not dealing with that. Whether the evidence was weak, whether it was strong, we don't have time to be coming to court day in and day out dealing with that. I don't know if no one anticipated that this thing would last as long as it did. I was listening to my first episode just to kind of refresh myself on what happened initially in the case. And I remember it was said that the trial was only slated to go on for several weeks. Several weeks. We had a break for several weeks. The jury got a break for several weeks. For about 2 months, there was a big break. Right? And so I'm sure Judge Whitaker realized out the gate, look, for these parties to be at this stage in the game when she just came in on the case, obviously it's highly contested. I'm not going to come in here and just sit down with everybody and say, why can't we work this out? I knew she wasn't naive to think she was just going to jump right in the case on a parachute and say, listen, I think we need to resolve this. Let's work this out. Y'all stay in the room for about 5 hours and don't come back into this a plea deal. No, that's not how this was going to work. Right? But what happened was, as the judge was presiding, and we saw this, Adrian Love kept showing that she did not have a grasp on this case. Judge Whitaker made comments on the record, which tells us, obviously, she made comments off the record. What the heck is going on? And she was looking at it from an obvious standpoint that how are we going to spend all this time and money dealing with this case? You got a jury away from their families. You got all this stuff going on, and we don't even have a reasonable expectation of an end date, and it seems as though you haven't even proven anything. And so what happened was you saw over the months since Judge Whitaker was on the case, a lot of mistrials were moved by various attorneys representing defendants in the case, right? And for the most part, those motions for mistrials were denied. And it was almost baffling to a lot of folks because they say, man, the judge be going off on a prosecutor, telling them about how ineffective they are and how not prepared they are and all these sort of things. But every time the defense lawyers move for a motion for mistrial, she deny it. What's going on? But it was apparent from Judge Whitaker's standpoint that whatever they were arguing, it didn't rise to a level of granting their mistrial until the recent matter involving Quamorvius Nichols. Now let's talk about this, y'all. Right? Quamorvius Nichols was one of the defendants. And then there's another co-defendant. His name is Marquavius Huey. And they both go by Quay. The state recently called the witness to the stand. He goes by Slime Life Shorty, right? He gets on the stand. The state presents him evidence. It's a picture. And on that picture, there's a hashtag saying Free Quay. And right then and there, Mr. Huey's lawyer moved for a mistrial. Now, let me break this down for y'all. The reason why it was a knee-jerk reaction for Mr. Nichols' lawyer to move for a mistrial was because when you see or hear something that says Free Quay, it suggests that Quay, whether it was Mr. Nichols, whether it was Mr. Huey, they are incarcerated. And so one of the rules of evidence as it pertains to a criminal trial, any suggestion that the defendant is incarcerated or that the defendant committed a crime, that's automatic grounds for a mistrial. Meaning, judge, this evidence is highly prejudicial to my client. It suggests that my client is a bad person. They already have been convicted. They're already doing time for a crime, whether it be this crime or another crime. And it paints my client as a bad person. And the last thing we want the jury to hear is evidence that my client is a bad person. Now, that doesn't mean every person thinks that way. But the law has guardrails in place that says, listen, you can't get into other evidence suggesting that this person is a criminal outside of what they're on trial for, or it meets the exceptions. And that's why they were able to get all these other crimes, bad acts, because that fell under an exception, right? And so this was Mr. Nichols' opportunity to get a mistrial, meaning this whole trial has to be a do-over. Think about the implications of this particular trial, which was and still is Georgia's longest trial. Because remember, you still got the two defendants that are still on trial for the murder of Donovan Thomas, right? Those murders just don't go away. Remember what I talked about many episodes ago? You still got that body bag. They don't just go away easily like these other plea deals that transpired last week. So these grounds for mistrial, this witness was a serious issue that put the trial to a pause and said, hold up, we need to think long and hard about this. And one of the things that the judge made it clear that if I grant a mistrial, it doesn't mean that it's going to be a mistrial with prejudice, meaning the state is not going to have a right to try it again. It means it may be without prejudice, which means the state will have to come in and try this case all over again. And so that puts everybody on notice. Do we really want to try this entire case all over again? And that's when I believe Judge Whitaker really morphed from the trial judge to the mediator. And so now she's getting the parties together and say, I understand the mistrial. I understand the severity of the evidence that came out and how it can potentially taint this jury. I don't know how I'm going to rule yet, but I'm taking it under consideration. And I think behind closed doors, that's when the judge really started working her magic and saying, you guys need to figure out a way to work this out. Because I'm not ready to tell anybody how I'm going to rule, but I do think, given all the time and resources that was put into this trial, we need to reassess everybody's position and see if there's an opportunity to work this out. That was a window of opportunity, right? And so what happened, you begin to see it forced the prosecutors and the defense lawyers to talk. And that's a hard thing to imagine because we've seen the tumultuous aspect of this particular trial. And that naturally happens in a trial, but sometimes you can have so much back and forth, so much name slaying, so much slandering, so much tension in a trial that the strife just forbids the ability of the parties to come together. But this was an opportunity that Judge Whitaker was not going to squander. She was going to take full advantage of saying, y'all need to sit down and work this out. And no, we may not have seen a record of that. No, that probably wasn't on video. But I have reason to believe that in some private room, whether it be chambers, whether it be outside under a tree, I don't know. But I'm sure Judge Whitaker said, listen, y'all folks need to get this together because this trial been going on for too long. But could you imagine Young Thug and his lawyers? Could you imagine Brian Steele and Keith Adams in this difficult position of trying to work things out? Yeah, Judge, we could work it out. All that means is the state needs to dismiss all these charges against my client because this is an injustice. They have made it clear that has been their position from day one. Jeffery Williams is not guilty on all these charges. This is an innocent man. This is a recording artist, highly successful. He doesn't even know most of these defendants, haven't spoken to them in years, and he's caught up in a whole lot of stuff that has nothing to do with what he's been focused on for so many years. He cannot be responsible for individuals who engage in crimes based on lyrics, if there's any truth to that. And so how do you get Jeffery Williams, right, to come to grips of agreeing to anything that he has contested for many, many years? And he has the lawyers who are more than equipped to stand firm in his innocence. And so there was some discussion back and forth between Young Thug's lawyers and the state of Georgia, but it collapsed. And so you had some back and forth. You had maybe some fruitful discussions, but Brian Steele, as he's before the judge, and it's very dramatic because he's in front of the judge, and the judge takes the bench and said, I understand we do not have an agreement. And so that tells us that there was some back and forth between both parties. This normally happens, but at the end of the day, Young Thug could not come to the terms in which the DA was presenting before him. He just couldn't do it. And so you see Brian Steele at the podium said, Judge, listen, you know my position. I was ready to see this thing all the way through. But yes, in the interest of working this out, we were at a position where Young Thug was proposed from the state to do probation, but the terms in which they levied on him, the conditions of that probation was just too much, too outrageous. They wanted him to acknowledge certain things that just weren't true. At some point, they wanted him to be a witness. Now, you already know that was a waste of time, but I guess the DA had to throw that out there since we're trying to work on the plea deal. But at the end of the day, it seemed like at the 11th hour, the parties could not reach an agreement. And so when Judge Whitaker takes the bench, she's like thinking that both parties worked this matter out and there was no agreement. And so it was a tense moment where the judge is waiting. Do we have an agreement? Do we not? And it was a long pause, a long silence, because eventually what it meant, if the parties didn't have an agreement, and if Young Thug was going to plead to some of the charges, then it meant that Young Thug would have to be at the mercy of the court. And that's why you may have heard the term blind plea. Young Thug took a blind plea because the plea negotiations broke down between the state and Young Thug and his attorneys. And so we don't have an agreement. And so now we're at a point where, yes, Young Thug is willing to plead no contest to some charge and even guilty to other charges. And now he's at the mercy of the court without knowing what the court is going to do in terms of sentencing. Y'all, let me tell you something. That's very scary. Whenever you're talking about a blind plea, what it essentially means is the defendant is willing to plead guilty to certain charges without knowing how the judge is going to sentence that person. Normally, as a criminal defense attorney, we want to know, with the exception of federal court. Federal court is totally different, y'all. It's generally a blind plea all the time, meaning your client is going to plead And the decision in terms of his or her sentence is left up to the judge. But at least in federal court, you have a chart. You have guidelines to see what sentencing structure your client may fall up under. Now, they can do downward departures, upward departures, which means they can deviate from the chart based on other circumstances, but at least you have some structure on where your client falls under those guidelines. But on a state court level, it's commonplace. If I'm working on a plea deal, I'm talking to the prosecutor and say, listen, can we plead to the terms of not only the conviction of the crime, but also the sentence? Let's agree to what this sentence is. It's called a peer plea. Or sometimes the prosecutors say, listen, I'm willing to work this out, but I'm going to defer sentencing to the judge. I'm not going to make a whole lot of noise. If you ask for 3 years, I'm not going to object to it. I'm going to just say, Your Honor, I defer to the court, right? And so that means all I need to do is have a meeting with the judge and say, Your Honor, the prosecutor and I have been engaging in fruitful discussions. These are the terms of the plea deal, but I just want to know, Judge, what sentence are you inclined to give my client? And what that tells the judge is, okay, if everything what you telling me checks out based on the client's criminal history or the lack thereof, based on all the circumstances surrounding the case, maybe the victim's impact statement, that sort of thing, this is what I'm inclined to give him. And now pretty much we have an idea on what the judge is going to give the client. And so we can work towards that plea deal. Every blue moon, you'll have a situation that maybe the judge was unaware of, and the judge say, listen, counselor, I'm sorry. I know I told you X, Y, and Z, but this information was not in front of me at the time. And normally, they'll allow your client to take their guilty plea back. I understand he thought he was going to get 3 years. What I'm looking at, I got to go with 10. But I'll give your client an opportunity to take that plea deal back. And you know what? That just means we got to go to trial. And he's looking at 20. And so that's the opposite of a blind plea. That's going in there knowing what your client's walking into. And so we've heard that this was essentially a blind plea. I'm not going to say this was a true blind plea deal. I don't think it was one of those blind pleas where Young Thug really didn't know what he was getting himself into. I think it was one of those, those pickaboo pleas. Like, I see you, judge. Don't mess over my client. Like, we trying to work this deal out. You were the one that wanted us to try to come together with the DA. Here we are. Don't screw us. You see what I'm saying? It was one of those where we know Brian Steele and Key Adams were firm in their positions. And so I think the lawyers understood, even not knowing what the judge was going to sentence their client to, Jeffery Williams, they had a strong reason to believe, look, the judge not about to screw us, right? The judge already know the only reason why we're here talking about a plea deal is the opportunity of Jeffery Williams getting out today, right? And so that's why when Brian Steele is before the judge, he's brilliantly telling the judge, listen, the DA just was willing to offer Jeffery Williams 15 years probation. And now they're standing before Your Honor saying he needs to be in here 30 plus years, right? This doesn't make any sense, Judge. If you saying this person is a violent individual and needs to be off the streets of Atlanta and not to have this kind of power and control over individuals, you were just okay with him having probation and being released. And obviously the judge agreed to that. But essentially the judge knew we not here unless Jeffery Williams and his lawyers are having a discussion to try to work this out, which was something that I strongly encouraged. And so Jeffery Williams coming to the table, even having a strong position of we not pleading to anything, the fact that him and his lawyers were at the table was the impetus to get this thing moving forward towards a resolution, which is exactly what the judge wanted. And so for Jeffery Williams to, even despite plea negotiations breaking down with the state, to put himself before the court without knowing what the court was going to sentence him, the judge was not going to slam this man. And his lawyers knew this. And if you remember, the judge said in her sentencing, of Jeffery Williams, listen, I'm acknowledging the fact that you were one of the parties who first came forward to work this case out. But if you realize, he actually was the fourth defendant who pled. You had Mr. Nichols who pled Tuesday, and then you had Mr. Ryan and Mr. Huey who pled that Wednesday, right? And so Young Thug was the fourth defendant, not one of the first. But I think what happened was Young Thug, and this is not shocking to anybody, Young Thug was the one who came to the table. Again, he was the catalyst, him and his lawyers. All right, let's try to work this out. And so once you got Young Thug working it out, you got Mr. Ryan's trying to work things out. You got Mr. Huey trying to work things out. You got Mr. Nichols trying to work things out. And all this is hinged upon this mistrial looming before everybody's head. So what Judge Whitaker did was brilliant in using this potential mistrial as an opportunity to work things out. And so you have Brian still making it clear, Your Honor, I did not want to do this, but it's not about me. It's about my client. And as defense lawyers, we got to deal with this all the time. Brian still said, listen, I told my client, and he even asked his client on the record, you mind me saying this? I told him, Judge, I think we could win this. But it was Mr. Williams who said, I'm the one that got to sit here for possibly 3 more months or longer. I'm the one away from my family. I'm the one that's eating out of a Dorito bag. I'm the one that's sleeping on this hard pavement. You see what I'm saying? And that's a real thing, y'all. As defense lawyers, regardless what how we feel and what we think and how confident we are in our case, we have to reduce ourselves and say, this is all about my client's interests. Because at the end of the day, we don't have a crystal ball. We can't tell them what's going to happen. We may be confident in the case. We may feel good about it. The evidence is flowing. The state's case is weak, but we don't know what that jury's going to do. And if our client is saying, listen, if we can guarantee the outcome of this case, and this means I could go home or have a strong likelihood of going home, that's what I'm willing to do. But a lot of y'all saw during the video Miss Love talking about, well, the state was going to prove this and the state was going to prove that and the state was going to prove this and this is part of the plea and Young Thug is the kingpin and yada, 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 yada. Hold up, Miss Love. Y'all spent over a year and y'all ain't proved that yet. So what makes you think you're going to convince the judge that this is the terms of the plea deal and the conviction? And so as you saw, Brian still brilliantly stands up and almost litigates this plea deal. And so he's re-urging his defense and a lot of stuff the judge never even heard, because remember, she didn't start on the case out the gate. And so you could see and hear his opening statements come back to life and his defense. And some things I don't think we ever even heard. I don't remember Brian still mentioning in his opening statements that the recording of 100 rounds on your Tahoe was pre-recorded to the murder of Donovan Thomas. See, that was one of the things that was going to blow up in the state's face. Listen, as defense lawyers, when we presenting our opening statements and presenting our defense to the jury, we keep a lot of stuff close to the vest. Right? We wait for that to blow up in the state's face where they don't have time to make adjustments. So some of the things you were hearing Mr. Steele was talking about, you heard some things for the first time because him and his defense team were waiting for the appropriate moment for that evidence to blow up in the state's face. Yeah, so at this point, you got to imagine Adrian Love is saying we don't have a plea. We understand Jeffery Williams is here to plead to the court and sentencing is up to the judge. But let me tell you all the evidence we had against Mr. Williams and what we were presenting to the jury. Judge Whitaker was there long enough to understand, Ms. Love, you weren't going to prove all that. So you high and mighty, we going to prove this and we had witnesses this and this is what Young Thug saying it so doesn't make it so. Yeah, just throwing it out there and hoping something gonna stick. You ain't moving nobody. You ain't. And then now Brian still comes and essentially presents his defense. And he's saying, Judge, I don't want to upset this plea deal. This is not about what I want. This is about what Jeffery Williams want. But let me tell you why I wanted to see this case all the way through. And he just laying out his defense brilliantly. Key Adams standing right on side of him. right? Keith Adams had an opportunity to articulate his position on behalf of Mr. Williams as well. I mean, it was a work of art, y'all. And so Keith Adams essentially said, Mr. Williams is putting himself before the court. And so again, this was, sort of a blind plea, but the defense lawyers essentially had a feeling on how the judge was going to lean, right? And the lawyer said that in their interview after the plea deal. They said, we were confident in Judge Whitaker. We were in front of a fair judge. We saw how she was ruling. And so y'all, basically, as we know, Young Thug is home. And like I said, it wasn't a storybook ending. And that's how most cases happen, y'all, unfortunately, right? Like, I'm going to tell y'all right now, some of the best closing arguments by defense lawyers don't go past the notepad, right? Because that case eventually works itself out. I never forget, man, I had a case in St. Landry Parish, 2nd-degree murder. My client was on trial. I mean, this was a highly contested case. My client, an African-American young male, was on trial for killing his girlfriend, who was a white woman. And there was a lot of noise in the media about how my client supposedly killed his girlfriend. And nothing can be further from the truth. Based on the evidence we had, we hired a criminalist in Georgia, actually. Right? We were trying a case in St. Landry Parish, Louisiana. Shout out to Christopher Robinson, who is a criminalist out of Georgia. We hired him as the blood spatter expert. We hired him as the ballistics expert. Shout out to Dr. Scoley in Florida. We hired her. She was our pharmacist, our toxicologist, to come and say the drugs that unfortunately the deceased consumed prior to her death. The state was presenting evidence from their pathologists to come in there and say, because you couldn't see the suit and the stippling on the victim's head, this was a long-range shot from my client. Our expert, Christopher Robinson, come in there and say, hold up. Did y'all account for the full head of hair that y'all shaved off the victim's head? And because the victim had a full head of hair, it can act as a barrier to the suit and the stippling. This is the residue from a gunshot that you would normally see from a close range shot. And since y'all didn't account for that, you can then see that this was in fact a close range shot. And unfortunately, the evidence points towards the fact that this was a suicide. And our pharmacist is going to tell you how much the victim was influenced by drugs and the amount of drugs that was in her system when she died, and her inability to make rational decisions. And if she's playing with a gun and she's under the influence of all these drugs while she has a gun with her DNA on it, how evidence points towards this was a suicide. I had my team, y'all. I had my legal assistant, shout out to Danielle Yates. And I had Alexandra Lawless, our jury consultant. Y'all, I had everybody lined up for this case. The position that the state took was this was a brutal murder. No. The state got this all wrong. Our client adored the deceased. Unfortunately, the deceased took her own life. We can't say it was intentional. We can't say it was an accident, but the evidence points strongly towards this was a suicide, not a homicide. And y'all, we picked that jury, and I ain't gonna lie, I practiced for many years in St. Landry Parish, y'all. This was the best looking jury in terms of the diversity I've ever picked. And so we were figuratively throwing a party about the jury that we selected. No, I'm not going to say just because we had more blacks on this particular jury than we ever had in the past. I've always said just because you got blacks, that don't mean it's going to be a not guilty. But all we wanted was a fair cross section of my client's peers. And so this particular jury was very diverse. And y'all, I get a phone call the day before opening statements from the prosecutor, and he asked me, would your client be willing to take negligent homicide? You got to understand, he was indicted for second-degree murder, and now the state is offering negligent homicide. So he done went from looking at life in prison to a maximum 5-year sentence in jail. Y'all, my client already did the 5 years, just waiting on his trial. And so despite the strong evidence that pointed towards my client's innocence, I had to set up an interview with my client on the phone because I get the phone call the night before opening statement, and I'm talking to my client and I said, listen, the state offered you negligent homicide, and I got to tell you, that means if you plead to this, you'll be going home tomorrow. That's hard, y'all. That's hard. So I feel what Brian Steele and Keith Adams went through when they had to tell Mr. Williams, listen, if you plead, there's a likelihood that you'll be going home tomorrow. That's a hard thing because, again, we got to reduce ourselves because it's the client who has to do the time. And so I will never forget, and I'm going to close y'all with this, but I'll never forget that next day, my client's parents came to court. I had to let them know what was going on, and we all met up in a room. My client's parents, sweet, genuine people who adopted my client many years ago. And so I never forget, the parents are in the room, and my client's like, Mom, Dad, y'all heard the good news? They offering negligent homicide. And to me, there's nothing good about that news, because it still means he has to plead to being responsible for someone he really loves death. And he was giddy and happy, because what did it mean? It meant that if he takes that plea, he gets to go home with his family. Y'all, Jeffery Williams, again, not a storybook ending, right? Not how they would have wrote it up in Hollywood, but the plea meant he gets to go home with the people he loved. He can put all this behind him and go back to continuing to be the person that he is, and the person that so many people embrace, love, and enjoy his music. And so I understand Brian Steele and Keith Adams' plight. I really do. And unfortunately, I know that wasn't the first time, and that it won't be the last time, that sometimes you just have to take a plea deal because you just can't deal with being in prison a minute longer. That's my time, y'all. You still got the trial going on. DeMonte Kendrick and Shannon Stillwell, they still got the murder trial going on. Again, that's the serious one. You know, that's the body bag, for lack of a better term. I spent a whole episode on that. Like, that's the one that just don't go away, right? And actually, I wouldn't be surprised if they worked out a plea deal on those two cases. But still in all, you're still dealing with Adrian Love, and you're still dealing with a lack of evidence. But now that you got full defendants out the way, now the jury can hone in on this murder. And so I don't know how that's going to play out. I'm a student of the game, so I'm still going to be interested. And listen, y'all, this podcast will not just be a Young Thug trial podcast. So I'm coming back with more. We got, like I said, we got things going on with P. Diddy. I'm going to have some other things in store for y'all, man. I think y'all going to like it. I'm going to bring some guests on. That's all in season 2, y'all. But right now, I got to finish strong. I got a lot to make up for y'all, man. Again, I apologize for being MIA for so long, but your boy is back. Continue to rock with me. Continue to support me. I don't take your support for granted. I really appreciate y'all patience. A lot of y'all keeping me accountable. Shout out to True, one of my best friends, saying, listen, man, I got to hear from you on this episode, man, in light of Young Thug's release. So I appreciate y'all. Your boy is back. I got more in store for y'all. That's my time. 1.
Call your first witness. I got Kenneth Willis. He bought his business, he gon' take it the distance. Listen, he giving gaming, believing high level represent. Call your first witness. Yeah, call your first witness.
Griff has been paid for this endorsement.